Hi. So today I wanted to talk about composting. Not the most glamorous subject in the world, but every garden should have a compost heap. A small one, big one, several of them. I've got about 9, but then I've got a big garden and I'm very lucky. Composting is a really brilliant way of taking waste organic material that otherwise you might throw in the brown bin and have carted off in dust cart, and turning it into beautiful homemade compost. And it's really ridiculously easy. People often make it sound complicated, but it's not. Honestly, it's not. So if you read books, including one of mine, The Garden Journal, which talks about composting, you might learn, for example, that the optimum carbon to nitrogen ratio of a compost heap is about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And the books will tell you that kind of dry organic material like hay and cardboard and wood chips is almost entirely carbon. There's hardly any nitrogen at all. Whereas lawn clippings and fresh green material, kitchen scraps, that kind of stuff, it's a vegetable, have too much nitrogen. They maybe have 15 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But what good is that to anybody, given that, you don't have a machine to measure the carbon to nitrogen ratio of anything you might have to hand? Actually, all you really need to know is that roughly, if you mix about equal parts of green material with equal parts of kind of brown, twiggy, woody, cardboardy material, then that's about right. So I've got some old hay that was left over from the guinea pigs. I've got cardboard loo rolls and bits of other cardboard packaging, and I've got this sawdust. So that's the carbon rich stuff. And then on the nitrogen side, I've got the lawn clippings. I've got some comfrey leaves from cutting back comfrey to make it flower again. I've got some vegetable scraps and whatnot. So if you just make a heap out of this stuff, the green stuff, because there's too much nitrogen in it, and what happens is it starts to ferment really quickly, and then it sinks down, it kind of collapses into a horrible sludge. So if you've ever left a pile of lawn clippings, then you try turning it over with a fork or a spade, you'll see what I mean. You get this kind of really stinky, wet, black, kind of tarry mass in the middle, which once it gets to that point, it rots down really slowly. So it's much better to mix this stuff up with this kind of stuff. Best with cardboard, it's best to rip it up and dampen it down. So here we go. Nice and wet, then rip it up. I've got a big bin here, I'm just going to throw everything in. Sawdust goes in. Grass cuttings and everything else. See, it's really complicated stuff. I'm a lazy composter. I don't really put that much effort into it at all. I rely mainly on time and nature to do it for me. And it really is a piece of cake. So basically you just get a whole bunch of organic material, mix it all up, and chuck it in the compost heap. And we're going to have a look at the compost heap in a second. In a few months' time, you'll have this stuff. It's like Blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. This is my homemade compost. It's a bit twiggy, it's a bit rougher than the stuff you might buy from the garden centre for £6, £7, £8 a sack. If you want to, you can sieve it, but I don't bother. I find plants grow really beautifully in it as it is. So let's go and have a look at what a compost heap actually looks like. So you can get these kind of barrel-shaped commercial compost heaps. The council, if you're lucky, might subsidise these to encourage you to compost. They're really easy to use. You just lift the lid off, chuck in whatever you're composting, and leave it. And after a few months, with a bit of luck, there's a door at the bottom, comes off, and out falls your compost. This needs leaving a little bit longer, to be fair. Or you can make much bigger compost heaps, which work actually quite a lot better, I think. So, this is one of my big compost heaps. This is just made from some 3 old wooden pallets. So they're just screwed together at the back corner there to make a kind of U shape. And then I just pile my compost in. So this is quite a new heap. All I do, so you chuck it all in there, and the amazing thing is it just starts to warm up on its own. So bacteria break down the organic material and generate heat, and the temperature starts to rise. And that actually kills the first wave of bacteria because they're not tolerant of higher temperatures, but then more bacteria move in that are able to cope with living at quite high temperatures, and they can push the temperature right up to about 70 degrees centigrade in the heart of a big compost heap, which kills all the weed seeds and helps to accelerate the whole decomposition process. Not that you need to know anything about that. Ideally, if you can be bothered, wait until that first wave of decomposition has finished and the temperature cools a bit, and you can stick your hand in and feel it. And then turn it over with a fork just to mix in the stuff around the edges that may not have got really hot. I usually forget and I just leave it all longer and it's fine. It really is the simplest thing in the world. You chuck in the organic material and wait. And if you leave it a long time, if you've got enough heaps so you don't need to empty it out regularly, then it becomes a really great habitat for wildlife when it's old. So a year-old heap, once it's cooled down a little bit, you might get grass snakes nesting in it. Bumblebees absolutely love to nest in old compost heaps. And of course compost heaps support a whole myriad of amazing little insects that are all part of the decomposition process. Plus non-insect invertebrates, things like woodlice and springtails and centipedes and millipedes, and all sorts of really cool stuff thrives in a compost heap. So why wouldn't you have a compost heap? So let's have a look at some of the cool creatures that will move into a compost heap. So once it starts to cool down after that initial really hot phase, you get a whole bunch of little creepy crawlies moving, particularly springtails. This is a springtail, fantastic little creatures, just a millimetre or 2 long. You can just about see them with the naked eye, and you can have hundreds of thousands of them living in a compost heap. There are lots of different species. So for example, there are these lovely globular ones which I think look a bit like a herd of miniature sheep with a bit of imagination. Springtails are called springtails because they can leap high in the air. They have a kind of lever-like rod under their body called a furcula, which pings downwards when they are frightened, and it fires them into the air. About 15 centimetres they can jump, which for their size is the equivalent of a man leaping over the Eiffel Tower. Quite impressive, really. Then of course there are woodlice, fantastic beasties, very common in compost heaps, actually crustaceans, relatives of crabs and lobsters rather than insects. Really important decomposers. They, just like the springtails, they nibble away on bigger pieces of organic matter and help to break it down into smaller pieces, which is exactly what you want. Astonishingly, there was an article in one of the tabloid newspapers a few months ago saying that if you have too many woodlice in your compost heap, you should spray with insecticide to kill them. And in fact you can buy commercial woodlice killer, believe it or not. Why anyone would sell it, I've no idea, given that these are pretty much entirely beneficial organisms, and you should welcome as many as possible into your compost heap. As of course you should worms. Worms are kind of master composters. In a compost heap you'll have many worms helping to aerate and break down the organic matter and so on. And millipedes, also good decomposers and fascinating gentle creatures.
As well as all the decomposing organisms, a compost heap will attract predators of those decomposers, things like centipedes, which are the kind of predatory relatives of millipedes, and rove beetles. These are rather odd-looking predatory beetles. Don't look very beetle-like, but common in compost heaps. And if you're really lucky, you'll get some other beasties too, things like this wood mouse. Actually, I say really lucky, these are very common in compost heaps. It's a lovely cosy place for them to spend the winter. And you'll also often find shrews too. These are carnivores that dash around at high speed, wolfing down any small creature they can find. Another very common resident of an old compost heap, as I mentioned, are bumblebees. This is a common carder bumblebee nest, which was in a compost heap. I find that most of my older, more than 1 year old compost heaps have at least one bumblebee nest in each year. They're actually more effective than putting out bumblebee nest boxes, ironically. Particularly the early bumblebee is the commonest one I find in my garden. You're also, if you're lucky, you might get fantastic things like slow worms, which like to eat any slugs and wood lice or whatever they can find. Beautiful, beautiful creatures. I've not yet had a slow worm, sadly, but I have had in my compost heaps, I've found grass snake eggs. But I have lots of grass snakes in my garden. Beautiful, stunning creatures. And the warmth from the compost helps to incubate their eggs for them, so they don't need to incubate them themselves like a bird would. So it's the perfect place for them to lay, and probably the reason why I have lots of grass snakes in my garden is simply because I have lots of old compost heaps. So basically, compost heaps support an absolutely amazing variety of life, making them a very important habitat to create in your garden.
So, give it a go for yourself. The bigger you can make them, the better they work, because the bigger they are, the easier it is to build up a good heat in the middle. But even a small compost heap, if you've got patience, will produce your very own beautiful homemade compost. There's something about the smell of freshly made compost which is just gorgeous to get your hands into. Give it a go, you'll love it. Thank you.